I want to welcome you to this podcast on international marketing strategy. My name is Mark Phillips. You've probably heard of me. I teach here in the College of Business at ACU. I'm your host for this guided quick journey through this topic. I can tell you that later this evening we will be giving away, for those of you that are still with us in the broadcast, prizes in cash worth $50,000. So you definitely want to stick around for that. Also, I just made that part up, so it's not true. But I hope you'll stick around anyway. This is kind of what we're going to try to do in this fairly short podcast. I want to talk to you a little bit about international markets, why they're a big deal, why companies who have spent their entire lives selling in one company or in one country are very quickly trying to go somewhere else and sell as well. We're going to talk about market entry models. Question being, if I want to go do business in another company or another country, see, I've said that wrong twice now. If I wanted to go business in another country, how do I get there in a way that minimizes my risk and maximizes my return? And finally, we'll talk just briefly about piracy, not the kind that happens on boats off of Somalia, but the kind that happens when you are looking at products that may have been made around the world in a factory that may not belong to the right people. Let me give you some headline news here. This was from March of 2007, and it's news that's relevant to those of us here in Texas, particularly any of you that are from the Houston area. The headline is, Halliburton will move HQ to Dubai. Oil services giant Halliburton Company will soon shift its corporate headquarters from Houston to the Mideast financial powerhouse of Dubai, Chief Executive David Lazar announced Sunday. Lazar said he will relocate to Dubai from Texas to oversee Halliburton's intensified focus on business in the Middle East and energy-hungry Asia. Quote, as the CEO, I'm responsible for the global business of Halliburton in both hemispheres, and I will continue to spend quite a bit of time in an airplane. But yes, I will spend the majority of my time in Dubai. The Eastern Hemisphere is a market that is more heavily weighted toward oil exploration and production opportunities, and growing our business here will bring more balance to Halliburton's overall portfolio, he said. And then this is a statistic that's driving this. More than 38% of Halliburton's $13 billion oil field services revenue last year stemmed from sources in the Eastern Hemisphere, where the firm has about one-third of its employees. So last year, Halliburton made almost 40% of its revenue from the Eastern Hemisphere, and that's why he's moving there. This is kind of a disappointment for us here in Texas. This is the oil patch, and we've always felt good about that, but he's acknowledging that in the future, a lot of the growth in his industry is not going to take place around here. It's going to take place on the other side of the world. Let me just give you some examples here of the kind of growth that have been experienced across the world. It's actually rather startling to take a look. These are some pictures that give you some sense of what happened in the country of Dubai over a period of about 15 years. The picture kind of shows you, looks like some highways running through and a few large buildings, and the top picture shows you what looks today like a very futuristic place. Dubai has grown faster than anyone can even imagine because there's unbelievable wealth in a place where you just pump stuff out of the ground and people pay you $100 a barrel for it. This is an example of some of the architecture that's taken place there. You probably know that whenever land is located on water, it becomes worth substantially more, and so this palm tree design was created to give as many people as possible a chance to be on the water. And so you can drive out onto this thing, and there are houses on both sides with waterfront views. You may not like hot weather. You may get tired of hot weather, and so you can actually go snow skiing. This is entirely indoor, enclosed, climate-controlled snow skiing there. So if it's 115 outside, who cares? Just strap on your skis and head into the snow. This is a hotel there. It's fairly famous. It's designed to look like a gigantic sailboat sail, and it's known for a lot of things, not the least of which is the fact that the cheapest rooms rent for about $1,000 a night. You can pay up to $28,000 per night if you'd like to have the penthouse room at the top. Just to give you some sense of how crazy expensive this place is, a good family friend of ours works in the Middle East and decided one time he would like to go in and take a tour. It's actually more than $200 just to tour the hotel. So they don't let just anyone in the door. Dubai is a place of crazy, crazy growth. Now, one problem that Americans run into when we start trying to go do business in other places is this one. People around the world have in their mind images of what Americans are like. They believe certain things about Americans, and some of those are true and some of those are false. but some of them are and let me just give you some things to think about here when we talk about America and how it's perceived around the world. We're talking here about stereotypes. And a stereotype is a perception or a belief about someone. We believe that people are a certain way because of their background, their skin color, their culture, their gender, their age, something else like that. The strange thing is stereotypes can actually be true. We may actually meet an old person who is a terrible driver, but that doesn't make the stereotype true. In other words, not all old people are terrible, scary drivers. So when we talk about Americans doing business overseas, one of the things that we want to look at is what are some of the stereotypes that non-Americans have about Americans. And I've done this exercise in class a number of times, and we typically get the same kinds of answers. Non-Americans perceive Americans as being a little bit arrogant. They perceive us as being convinced that we are the best and that we need to be kind of setting policy for the rest of the world. They also, in some cases, have stereotypes of us which are not so bad. For example, in many cases, they have the perception that almost all Americans are extremely good looking. Probably because they've watched a lot of American television where, most of the characters are really good looking. In some cases, they also perceive Americans as being fairly well educated, which compared to a lot of places in the world we are. I've had a few students from other countries that have said the perception in their country of the U.S. is that the U.S. is a generous country, which made me feel pretty good. I've had others who say the perception in their country is that the U.S. is basically a war-hungry nation. And given the amount that we spend on defense, I guess I can understand where that comes from. A lot of interesting questions surrounding this one. Why do stereotypes exist? And typically it's because we like to put people in categories. We like to be able to classify people in groups, and that simplifies the world for us. And so if we've seen 2 or 3 people that behave a certain way, we tend to try and draw a conclusion. And so if we've met 2 or 3 rude Americans, this tells us that, well, maybe all Americans are rude. Having said that, I would just caution you that when we do business overseas as Americans, number one, we need to know what the stereotypes are in that country. And number two, we need to go out of our way to avoid those stereotypes. The only way that stereotypes typically are taken down is when people get enough experience to demonstrate that the stereotype is not true. So, for example, if people are convinced that all French people are rude, then the way that they change those perceptions is by going to France and meeting folks who are not rude. I can tell you the first time we went on study abroad, we took a group of students over and we were going on our trip to France, and everybody's perception was, wow, the French are going to be really snotty and rude. And we came back from the trip to France and we sat down and talked, and the people said, you know what? The people I met in France were nicer and more friendly than the people that I met in England. Kind of an interesting thing. So as an American, you need to go over there knowing that Americans are perceived as loud and boorish and obnoxious and overbearing, and you need to go out of your way to be respectful of other cultures and to be polite and to listen a lot and maybe not talk quite so much. Doing business internationally is risky. This shouldn't surprise us. If there's a lot of money to be made there actually is a lot of money that can also be lost. And so just let me tell you a very brief story about the nation of Cuba. Cuba's been back in the news lately because we're hopeful that at some point relations with Cuba will get better. But let me kind of walk you through some things that happened in Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro took control of Cuba. Prior to that, it was a fairly independent country, had a lot of direct ties to the U.S. March of that year, well, let me just put these on the screen here and maybe let me go back and tell you what happened then, because I can't read what they say and you can't either. Okay? No idea where all the words went. Let me just tell you. As you go through 1959 and into 1960, this is what you see take place. Cuba gradually enacts more and more strict regulations dealing with business. At that time, a lot of the business in Cuba was owned or controlled by American corporations. A lot of sugar cane was grown there by American companies. A lot of other stuff was done there that Americans owned. A lot of the real estate and the commercial real estate in particular was owned by American interests. And so Cuba gradually began cracking down They nationalized all the sugarcane plantations, which means basically they just said, you know, you don't own this anymore. We own it now. They also started putting restrictions on how much property people could own. So basically, if you were an outsider and you owned a big piece of commercial real estate, like an apartment complex, very quickly you didn't own it anymore. The government did. By the time it was all said and done, Cuba basically had taken over everything in the country, and the American companies who were doing business there had lost literally everything they had invested. Cuba is probably one of the worst examples where in the space of about 18 months, it went from being a place that was very business friendly to being a place where you really couldn't do business at all. Now when we look at these risks and we talk about what goes on in the international environment, there are a couple of things that we want to talk about. The first are what we call political risks, and these have to do with the fact that in many countries the government is not stable. In many countries, you don't know who's going to be in charge next month or next year, and it's possible for all the rules to change overnight. We also run into what we call economic risks. An economic risk is simply the idea that when we are involved in someone else's economy, we are at the mercy of that economy. Not all economies are as stable as ours. In some cases, countries have devalued their currency. In some cases, exchange rates can change radically in a very short period of time. And so when we've spent $1 billion on a facility over there, if exchange rates change, potentially it becomes an $800 million facility. And that's extremely painful for us. So here's some specific examples of things that can happen, that have happened in various countries. Political risks, obviously warfare that goes on between one nation or another. You might look at this and go, yeah, I know about Palestine and Israel, I know about Iraq, I know about North Korea. Why is Pakistan and India on that list? Pakistan and India is on this list of political risks because Pakistan and India share a border. They have a disputed territory between them called Kashmir, and Pakistan and India both have nuclear weapons, which is why when Pakistan and India get upset with people or with each other, people get nervous. And so you're going to continue to hear about Pakistan and India for the foreseeable future. Economic risks, the economy can fail, the money can be devalued, changes in the European Union, etc., etc. All these things represent risks to companies doing business there. Now, just let me give you some examples here of things that can happen when you're managing a multinational firm. So in this case, we're talking about some person who is managing a company. They don't just do business in the U.S., even if, across the whole U.S. They do business in the U.S., they do business in Canada, they do business in Brazil and Argentina and Costa Rica. All right? And so whenever we move into another market, a market outside our home country and our home culture, some of the risks that we run into are these. First of all, and probably most importantly, is the fact that we may not know the culture. We may go in there not understanding how things work, and I'll give you some examples of that. In some countries, it is very different when you buy things. For you to purchase something, you have to go through a number of steps to do it. In some countries, for you to have things done at your office, for instance, having the phone service installed, you may be required to pay someone a bribe to get the phone put in. In this country, that's illegal. In their country, that's the way business is done. Christians trying to do business would be when we go into countries where two business clients working together, one of them may be expected to entertain the other one in ways we wouldn't be comfortable with. For example, in some cultures, if I'm trying to sign a contract with you to do business and I invite you out for an evening, you may well expect that while we're out at that evening, I will not only buy you dinner, I will buy you a great deal to drink, and at the end of the evening, I will have provided a prostitute for you to spend the night with. That is the commonly accepted practice in some places in the world. As a Christian trying to do business there, this is going to be a challenge, because that is not the kind of business I want to be doing. And yet in that culture, that's what's expected. So I will have to make a choice about what I'm going to do there. Let me give you an example here of why companies sometimes choose to do business outside the U.S. In some cases, not only do they do business by selling their product outside the U.S.,